Okay, we're on Kuf Gimel Amud Beis 103b toward the bottom of the page. Mishnah. Okay, so of course we spoke about this yesterday and the day before, and we'll get to it again. Two ways to accept the field. You can do mikabel or you could do chlecher. Mikabel is typically a relationship where a certain percentage of the harvest goes to the owner of the field, and a chaycher pays a fixed amount. You might say a chaycher is like a renter. He leases the field for a fixed amount, and that's the only payment that goes to the owner. Whereas a sharecropper is giving a sharecropper different types of sharecroppers, but basically they're giving a certain percentage. So you have a field, it's a beis hashlochen. What's a beis hashlochen? It has to be watered. Okay, but sure enough, this field has convenience. Or it's a field that has a tree on it, and it's the custom in this town that if you sharecrop this field, you get to eat from that tree as well. So it's a bonus. Okay, and now this beis hashlochen had a spring that was right next to it. What happened? Yavish hamayan, the spring dried up. Or of niktzat se'ilan, there was sort of a bonus by taking from this tree, but now the tree got cut down. You do not get it. You do not. If you're a chaycher, you don't get to pay less rent. And similarly, if you're a makabel, you don't get to give the landlord a smaller payment. In other words, you can't say, look, beis hashlochen, it's a field that has to be watered. If there's a spring on site, it's less work. So that's why I agreed to do it for, 30%, giving you 30% of the harvest. But now that I have to go schlep water, I'm only willing to give you 25%. Or instead of giving you $1,000 for the year per acre, I'm only giving you now $750 because I have to do a lot of schlepping to carry the water. So none of these arguments are valid. We'll explain why. Let's say, however, he specified, I'd like you to water this field that requires watering, or I want you to the guy accepts to plant and harvest this field that has a tree next to it. So besides taking the 70%, or whatever it is, 50%, let's say, of the harvest, I also get to take from the tree. So if that was mentioned, then basically what he's saying is he's tying his work to the bonus, whether the bonus means that he has to work less because there's a spring, a water hole on the property, or because he has a tree on the property and gets his bonus from that tree. Because he tied that together, so therefore he's entitled to give a smaller payment to the landlord if the tree gets cut down or the spring dries up. Says the Gemara, hey Chidami, what's the scenario? Ilim diyavish nar rabba, that there was a large river and the river dried up. Why is it that you don't get to deduct some of the rent money, the lease money? Because it's much more difficult now. The guy has to go, there was a big river and the river dried up. Now the guy has to go schlep out to go carry water. One second. Namelay Makas Medinahi. The renter, the lessor, can tell the guy, look, it's a problem for the entire Medina. The entire state has to deal with this problem. And because of that, I also get to deduct some of the rent. We all share the burden equally. It's like insurance, all of our rates go up. Okay, so Amar Papa says the Yavish Narazuta. It actually wasn't a big river, it was a small river. There was a small river or a small, water hole. It dried up, and the owner of the property, the landlord, says, "Look, you can carry water with pails." Amar Papa says, "Hani tarti masnisa Kamma." Okay, so far we saw two mishnayos in this parak. The first mishnah. The first mishnah was with regard to the customs of the field. what exactly are they obligated to do? Is the obligation to harvest, to cut the weeds, to uproot the weeds, to plow after the harvest has already happened? And the second Mishnah was whether when the water hole dries up. These two scenarios are true both of a choicher, a lesser, and a mekabel, a sharecropper. It's true both of a choicher and with a sharecropper. However, from here onward in this parak, the isa b'kablanusa less of klakranusa, the isa b'klakranusa less of kablanusa. The Mishnayos are either lessers or sharecroppers, but not both. And we'll have to explain, obviously, as we go along, which the future Mishnayos which are in which category. Okay, so the guy says to his friend, I'm leasing this property that has the watering hole nearby. It's a field that needs to be watered. Beis hashlochen, by definition, is a property that needs to be watered. And he mentions the fact that there's a watering hole nearby. Or he says this field that has a tree next to it. So I get the bonus of not only do I get the sharecropping of the field, I also get bonus. I can take an equal amount from the tree. Okay, so now the Gemara's question is as follows. You have this today, especially with, there are many locations that have the name orchard in it, or field in it. And there's no field there. There's no orchard. There's no vineyard. The name is, the location's name includes orchard or vineyard. But it doesn't actually, I don't know if there's a vineyard in Martha's Vineyard. Right? There's a location called Martha's Vineyard, and it either does or doesn't have a vineyard in it, but that's totally besides the point. So the Gemara says maybe that argument could be true here as well. In other words, who says when the guy when the lesser says I want a beis hashlach, a water, field that has to be watered, who said it means that actually there's a field that needs to be watered? Maybe it's the name of a location. The amai was why does he get a deduction? Because he specified the field needed to be watered. Why can't the owner say this is the name of the location? We call it, David's orchard. Mila Tanya, did we not learn in a brayso? A guy says to his friend, I'm selling you a field that's full of dirt. Even if it only has half the measurement of a core. The sale is valid. What he sold him was the name, and as long as the property has a name, John's earth dump, John's base core of earth, it doesn't make a difference how much earth is actually there. If that's what it's called, then the sale is valid. Similarly, he sells him a vineyard. Even though there are no vines, the sale is valid. The property was called, Sam's vineyard. Whether there was actually a vineyard or not is besides the point, and therefore the sale is valid. Kamma, provided that the property was known as Sam's vineyard.
Otherwise known as Greenland.
Yeah. Yeah. A guy sells his friend an orchard. Even though it doesn't have any pomegranate trees, the sale is valid. As long as the property is called an orchard, then even if it doesn't have the fruit trees on it, the sale is still valid. Alma, we see from here, if it is a valid argument for a man to say to his friend, I sold you a property that has the name orchard, vineyard, earth dump, basically. Why can't the landlord say to the guy, I didn't mean to give you a discount if there's no watering hole nearby. I meant to say that this property is known as, my wheat fields. Or my vegetable patch, which does have to be watered. So Shmuel says like Kasha. Shmuel tries to resolve this. It depends who called it the orchard or who called it the vegetable patch. if the landlord, the lessor, says it to the lessee, then we rely on, then we say the landlord is selling him a location. But if the lessor says to the lessee, if the lessee says to the lessor, I'm renting a property that has to be watered, so then we take him seriously. If the watering hole dries up, he's entitled to a discount in his rent. If the landlord says to the renter, Shma Ba'almo, then it's just a name. He said to him just a name. But if the renter says to the landlord, then that is a kepeda, that's a specification, where he's only agreeing to do the work, to farm the land, on condition that there's a watering hole nearby. Ravina proposes, both scenarios could be where the landlord tells the renter, the farmer. You note in the Mishnah, it says, the guy mentions the word zeh, this one. Now, typically, whenever the word zeh means, you're pointing to it. I.e., he's on the property. He says to him, I'm renting you this property. Now, what's the need to repeat yourself and say it's a beis hashlochen? It's a field that has to be watered. Or to say that it has that tree on the property. When he means to say that the field needs to be watered, he means to say it needs to be watered, and there is the watering hole, and if the watering hole dries up, you're entitled to a discount in rent. If he was trying to give him a location, there's no reason to give a location when you're on the field. A location is when you need to know how to get there. But if you're on the field and you're pointing to the field, there's no reason to tell him a location. So it must be when you said this location, and you said it was a beis hashlochen, you didn't mean that the name of the property is beis hashlochen. You meant to say that this is a property that has to be watered. Next Mishnah. So this is a lazy fellow. He accepts to farm a property, and what do you think he does? He collects the easements and all the property tax benefits. He sells the water rights, and he doesn't do anything with the fields. He leaves it fallow. Okay, so the guys, we evaluate what's the typical yield of this field, and it gets paid to the landlord. And the reason for this is because the typical document that a landlord writes to a sharecropper says something like, if I leave the field fallow and I don't work it, I pay what the yield would have normally been. Okay. Now, obviously, this Mishnah is a Mishnah of sharecropping, because a chaycher is a renter. He has to pay rent. Why wouldn't he have to pay rent? You rent a car and you decide not to drive it, you still have to pay the lease payments or the rental fee. This is a scenario where the guy's a sharecropper. He has to pay 30% or 50%, whatever it is. But if he didn't work the field, there's no 50%. So that's where we say, no. You wrote in the document that if you leave the field fallow, then you don't have to pay. Then you have to pay what it would have normally yielded. So therefore, that's what you have to do. Now you're probably thinking that olive forge. What is this? It's an asmachta. There's no reason to. This is nobody thought that you weren't planting the field. This wasn't a realistic probability. We'll get to it. This obviously could definitely potentially be an asmachta. So we'll discuss it. The Gemara we'll get to it. Okay. Now, one more point here, which is really to set it up the next Gemara. The Gemara is this contract between a machkir and a chaycher, between a landlord and between a makabel, between a landlord and a sharecropper, is not necessarily a rabbinical decree. It isn't necessarily the case that the rabbi has said this is exactly how the document has to be. This was just the normal way of writing documents. So we'll see in the Gemara that we'll learn a lot of things from how contracts are normally written, even if there's no rabbinical requirement to write a contract that way. So this obviously is an example. This is the typical custom of how people wrote documents, and because of it, we say that the sharecropper must pay the owner in case he's lazy and leaves the land fallow. Okay, says the Mishnah. Says the Gemara, Reb Meir hayuder shlosh hedyot. this word of Derish Lashon Hedyet, it means the same idea. It means that he would interpret standard contract terminology, even when it wasn't required by a rabbinical decree. The Tanya we learned, Rameir Omer, Im Oiver V'le Avid, Ashalom B'meitva. Our Mishnah is typical, the typical Mishnah is authored by Rameir, even if it doesn't have Rameir's name attached to it. And the Brisa says it specifically, exactly what our Mishnah says. Rameir says that if you leave the field fallow and you don't work the field, Ashalom B'meitva, you have to pay what it would normally yield. Rabbi Yehudah Haydar Shloshon Hedyet. Rabbi Yehudah would interpret standard contract terminology. The Tanya we learned. Rabbi Yehudah Aimer, Adam Evi Carbon Asher Al Ishtay. V'chein Kol Carbon V'Carbon Shichayevas. A man is obligated to provide let's go backwards. Let's say a woman is obligated in a carbon. Typically, the reason why she'd have to bring a sacrifice in the context that we're referring to is because she had a tumah hayotz min haguf, a tumah that leaves the body. That would be either a zava or a yeledes, or the other ones to be or mitzvah. So mitzvah, zava, yeledes, or in that category, even though mitzvah isn't technically a tumah hayotz min haguf, it's typically put in the same category. To become tahor, you have to bring a sacrifice. The husband is obligated to bring his wife's sacrifice. That means that, let's say his wife, they share finances. His wife doesn't really have any of her own income, and all of it, if she does, it all goes to her husband. So technically, she's poor. So maybe her husband can bring her the sacrifice of a poor woman. He says, no. He has to bring, because he is obligated to provide her sacrifices according to his own wealth his own wealth. If he's wealthy, he has to provide her a full ox for each sacrifice. How do we know this? Because as follows, because when she gets divorced and she collects ksuba, part of collecting the ksuba is that she releases him from every obligation that he has had to her. Meaning, obviously, that there were obligations that the man has accepted to provide for his wife. And what are those obligations? To bring a sacrifice. So it's a very interesting interpretation, because this is not an interpretation of the ksuba document, it's an interpretation of the receipt for ksuba. But that indicates to us what sort of obligation was in effect throughout the period of the ksuba. Okay. Hillel Hazaken Haydar Shloshon Hedyet. Similarly, Hillel interpreted standard contract terminology. Tanya we learned, Anshe Alexandria Haymekachnes Nishasem. The people of Alexandria, they would give kedushin to their wives. Ubishas Knisasan L'Chupon, when they were about to get married. Apparently, this is a serious problem in town. People would steal brides literally underneath the bridal canopy, underneath the chuppah. Because this practice was widespread, the rabbis decided to declare that all the children were mamzerim. Because obviously, if a woman has received kedushin, she's considered a married woman, and if somebody steals her, then they're having a relationship with the married woman. The children are mamzerim. Amarlam Hillel Hazaken, so Hillel Hazaken says, at the time that they gave the kedushin, they wrote a ksuba. Let me see what it says in that ksuba, so I can see if there's a way to release these mamzerim to allow them to get married. Hill realized that the contract stipulated that the kedushin wasn't valid immediately. It was valid only when they get married. And since they did not end up getting married, maybe because of evil bride snatchers, but nevertheless, the legal kedushin was not binding until they actually got married, because they didn't get married. Therefore, there was no legal kedushin. For they also been mamzerim, and the children were not mamzerim. Rabbi Shmuel Karcha would similarly interpret contracts. The Tanya we learned, Rabbi Shmuel Karcha Aimer, Hamalva es chavera lo yimashkenenu yoser mechayvei. A person who gives a loan to his friend. We should point out here that there are two types of collaterals. Typically, when we talk about a collateral here, we typically talk about security-based lending. That means you hand over a security, and then I give you the loan, right? So you give me you park your car in my lot, you give me the keys, and then I give you the loan. In Gemara terminology, that actually is called herhinu. It's a separate discussion. But typically, a mashkin is when you don't pay. So a guy borrows $100. He doesn't pay the loan. The lender now comes to the borrower and he collects from him a collateral. If you don't pay within a certain time frame, I'm going to sell the collateral and collect and use it to collect the loan.
It's more like a surety than a collateral.
It could be. I'm not familiar with this specific word, but it could be. That would make sense. Okay. Okay, so now, says Rabbi Shimon Karcha, you're limited to take that collateral no more than the value of the loan. Why? The entire loan that I will collect will be from the value of this item, meaning the value of the item cannot exceed the value of the loan. Samar says, "Time of the kosel." This is typically written in a document when the court authorizes him to collect a collateral. But let's say he did not write it. Like Kanye, would he not get the collateral? But we see that Rabbi Yehudah says you don't need to write anything to get a collateral. Mishkanai, if let's say a fellow collects a collateral, umes, and the borrower dies, he passes away. The general rule is that the movable items of a father are not obligated to pay the loan, only the real estate. Now, of course, you should add that since the time of the Gaonim, about 1,000 years ago, this was changed. And in today's day and age, all property, even movable items, are also obligated to the loan of the father. But at the time of Chazal, it was not like that. The movable items were not obligated to repay the loan. However, a collateral that was collected, even though it was returned, still obligated to the father. You collect it from the children. So clearly we see without any documents, there's still a kinyan, there's an obligation to the loan. So the Gemara says, Ahani ksivo ligiroin. The document helps that if the collateral decreases in value, you're entitled to collect another collateral. The truth of the matter is that the kinyan is valid, even without a specific document. Okay. Rabbi Yossi would interpret normal contract terminology. The Tanya we learned. Rabbi Yossi Aimer, I'm sorry, 1 second. Okay. In a place where they would treat the ksuba like a loan. Okay, now the ksuba in this context doesn't actually, so typically the ksuba in the past we've said was mona masayim, it was 100 or 200. If they get divorced, the husband has to pay his wife this 200 zuz penalty. However, there are also additions to the ksuba. Like we pointed out, Ashkenazi ksuba, and a typical Ashkenazi ksuba is a very standard format. The ksuba constitutes the $200 the 200 zuz obligation between the husband to the wife, and the wife promises her husband 200 zuz nadin, a gift of 200 zuz. Now I don't know that this gift is actually given. It doesn't have to actually be given. If the husband accepts it, it's as if it's given. In Sephardic ksubas, they do write custom ksuba, and there are large gifts that are often given. They give a house, they put the house in the ksuba. The guy writes to the father of the bride writes to the groom, I'm giving you a gift of a house. Okay, so and now they get divorced. Then the woman or her inheritors are entitled to collect that house that he promised her as a nadin, as a gift. That house goes back after they get divorced. Okay, lichfal, to double the value, bavametzia. So now there was another custom to try to show respect to the groom. They would double the value of the gift. So let's say the house was worth $500,000. They would write at $1 million house. And this was a well-known custom. So then, obviously, she doesn't collect $1 million house. She only collects a $500,000 house. The people of the town of Nahar Veloy, Gavu Tilsa, they would collect a third. In other words, they would triple the value. Mireimar Magvunami Shivcha. Mireimar not only would add, one second. Yeah. Mireimar would collect the full $1 million. The Bryce says otherwise. The Bryce says that if they double the value, you only collect half the value, the $500,000 house, not $1 million house. So Gemara says, it depends on whether or not there was a kinyan. If there was a kinyan, then the husband accepts $1 million obligation, even though he only gets a $500,000 house. One second. Okay, now we should point out that this sort of standard relationship was either written in the document or understood by the common individual, and therefore this is what we say. Rabbi Yossi is interpreting contracts. Ravina mashbech v'kasav lebartei. Ravina he offered his daughter, let's say, a $500,000 house, and he wrote in the document $1 million house. So so the groom says, "Niknei, let's make a kinyan on $1 million house. Let's say that you're serious about giving me this $1 million house." Demar Amar Lahu, no. He says, "Imikna loy michbel." If you want me to make a kinyan, it's a $500,000 house. If you don't want to make me a kinyan, we can call it $1 million house. Because he was concerned that if they made a kinyan, then one second. Then he would be on the hook for $1 million. Hahu gavra the Amrlu Havula Arba Me'azuzi Libarti Biksubasa. There was this groom, and they promised him that for your bride, we'll give her 400 zuz dowry. Shalach Ravacha brother of Eva Rashi. Ravacha, the son of Eva, came in front of Rashi, and he wants to know what's 400. Is it 800 or is it 200? Right? Meaning, is 400 half of 800 because they doubled the value, or is it actually the doubled value and it really is 200? So he said, is it 400 that's really 800? Or is it 400 that's really 200? We see, did he say 400 zuz that we're going to call 800 zuz? Or did he say 400 zuz that's really 200 zuz? It depends on what he said. Ikadamri, another version is Amar Rashi Chazinan. Yamar Liksubasa, Arba Me'azuz the Inan Tamni Mea. Yamar Biksubasa, Arba Me'azuz the Inan Masan. Depends on the exact terminology that was used. Was it Liksubasa for the Ksuba, or was it Biksubasa in the Ksuba? If it was Liksubasa for the Ksuba, then it's 400, 800. Yamar Biksubasa in the Ksuba, so then it's that's the number that should actually be written, meaning 200, half of it. Okay, Velohi, and the Gemara concludes that this is not correct. The 400 zuz is really 200 zuz. One second. Unless he says 400 zuz without mentioning the ksuba. If there's a mention of the ksuba, then the number that's mentioned is really half of that number. So if he says for the ksuba, I'm giving you 400 zuz, it's 200. Whether it's in the ksuba, for the ksuba, it makes no difference. If he says I'm going to give you a gift of 400 zuz, then it's 400 zuz, because then it's not in the ksuba. It's only when it's tied to the ksuba that we had this custom to double the value. But when it's not in the ksuba, we don't do that. We don't do that. Okay. Hahu Gavra, the Kabul Aram and Chavrai. There was this fellow that agreed to sharecrop his friend's property. Amar, he said, if I keep it fallow, I'll give you 1,000 zuz. Okay. Over tilsa, he left a third of the field fallow. Amrina hardoi dinahu diyovle tlas mea. V'tilsin utilsa v'tilsa. The law is that you give him 333 and a third. He has to pay the fellow for keeping the field fallow. Just like he stipulated in the contract, there's $1,000 zuz penalty for leaving a fallow. You left a third fallow, you pay a third of 1,000. So Rav says, "Asmachta asmachta lekanya." This is an asmachta. It's a what if scenario. It should not be taken seriously, and therefore the kinyan is not valid, and you don't have to pay anything. So the Gemara says, "What do you mean?" What about the Mishnah? The Mishnah says clearly that if you keep the property fallow, you have to pay for the rough equivalent of the yield. So the Gemara says, "Hasam like a gosam, hacha keeping the Kamma miltzi serta guzam balmo." In our Mishnah, he doesn't give an extravagant number. He gives a realistic number. He says, if I don't plant the field, then I'll pay you what you would have earned equivalently. This guy is very extravagant. He gives $1 million, thousands of those. It's clearly a joke. It's an exaggeration, and therefore it's not to be taken seriously. It's to be taken as an asmachta, and it's not valid. Okay, interesting story here. Hahu gaver the kabel ar l'shumshumi. He accept. Continue for 2 minutes. He accepted a property to plant sesame seeds. Zorachiti, he planted wheat. Of the chiti kishumshumi. Now, generally, sesame seeds have a much higher value per acre than wheat. Also, sesame seeds apparently damage the property, damage the ground, the soil. You have to put more fertilizer next year. So this guy instead of planting sesame seeds, he planted wheat, and he was so successful with his wheat crop, he actually made the same amount of money as if he would have planted sesame seeds. Rav Kahana says, well, maybe he should make a deduction of the value because the property the soil won't degrade as quickly as if he would have planted sesame seeds. So instead of paying him the full value of what he would have gotten from sesame seeds, he should deduct the value of the lack of decrease in degradation in the property that would have happened had he planted sesame seeds. So Rav Ashi Rav Kahana, so Rav Kahana, no. Amri inchi kichsha arav loylik chishimara. Let the property degrade in value as long as I don't degrade. Meaning, I expected the full price. So the field has a little less degradation, fine, but that wasn't what the point here. I was willing to sacrifice that degradation to get the full value. So therefore, you too have to pay me the full value. Okay, have a great day. Happy Yom Tov.
Tomorrow, what time?
I believe it's an hour before Mincha tomorrow. Both days.